Jerusalem was once a city of glory, a city chosen by God, a city where the temple stood as a symbol of his presence. But now, its walls lay in ruins, its gates had been burned with fire, and its people lived among the rubble, vulnerable to their enemies and surrounded by shame. Far away from Jerusalem, in the powerful Persian kingdom, lived a man named Nehemiah. Nehemiah was not a soldier. He was not a king. He was not a prophet. He was the king's cupbearer. Every day, Nehemiah stood in the presence of King Artaxerxes, one of the most powerful rulers in the world. His position was one of great trust. He tasted the king's wine before it was served, ensuring that no poison reached the royal table. He lived within the safety and comfort of the palace. But despite being far from Jerusalem, his heart had never forgotten his people. One day, Nehemiah's brother Hanani arrived from Judah with several men. Nehemiah welcomed them warmly, but before long, he asked a question that had been weighing on his heart. How are the Jews who survived the exile? And what has become of Jerusalem? Hanani's expression changed. The answer was not what Nehemiah hoped to hear. The people who survived the exile are there in the province, but they are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates have been burned with fire. Nehemiah froze. For a moment, he said nothing. The palace around him suddenly seemed distant. The sounds of servants and officials faded into the background. All he could think about was Jerusalem, the city of his ancestors, the city that represented God's covenant with his people, the city that was supposed to stand strong, now lay broken. Nehemiah could no longer hold back his emotions. He sat down and wept, not for a few moments, not for an hour. He mourned for days. He fasted. He prayed. He carried the pain of an entire nation in his heart. But Nehemiah's grief was not the end of the story. It became the beginning. Day after day, he cried out to God, "Lord, God of heaven, you are great and awesome. You keep your covenant of love with those who love you and obey your commands. Please let your ear be attentive, and your eyes open to hear the prayer your servant is praying." Nehemiah did not begin by blaming the king. He did not begin by blaming the people. He began with God. Then he confessed, "We have sinned. I confess the sins we Israelites, including myself and my father's family, have committed against you. We have acted very wickedly toward you." Nehemiah understood something important. Before rebuilding the walls, there had to be a rebuilding of the people. He reminded God of his promise that even if his people were scattered to the farthest places on earth, if they returned to him, he would gather them again. And then Nehemiah made a bold request. He knew he would eventually have to stand before the king, and the king could either open the door or close it forever. So Nehemiah prayed, "Lord, let your servant be successful today, and grant him favor in the presence of this man." The man he was referring to was the king. Nehemiah had no army, no political power, no guarantee that the king would listen. But he had something else, a burden, a prayer, and a God who could open doors no human being could open. The broken walls of Jerusalem were about to become the assignment that would change Nehemiah's life forever. But first, he would have to stand before the most powerful man in the kingdom and ask for permission to rebuild the city. The journey was about to begin. Days passed after Nehemiah began praying. Every morning, he returned to his duties in the palace. He served the king. He carried the cup. He performed his responsibilities faithfully. But inside, his heart was still in Jerusalem. The image of the broken walls would not leave his mind. The burned gates, the ruined city, the people living in fear. And now Nehemiah knew what he had to do. He had to ask the king for help. But there was a problem. Nehemiah could not simply walk into the king's presence and make whatever request he wanted. Approaching the king while displaying sadness could be dangerous. Yet one day, as Nehemiah stood before King Artaxerxes with the king's wine in his hand, the king noticed something. "Why does your face look so sad when you are not ill?" This can be nothing but sadness of heart. Nehemiah became terrified. He knew the king had noticed him, and now there was no hiding. For a moment, Nehemiah stood silently before the most powerful man in the Persian Empire. Then he answered, "May the king live forever." Why should my face not look sad when the city where my ancestors are buried lies in ruins, and its gates have been destroyed by fire?" The king looked at him. Then came the question Nehemiah had been waiting for. "What is it you want?" Nehemiah knew this was his moment, but before he answered, he prayed, silently, quickly, in his heart. Then he spoke, "If it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in your sight, send me to the city in Judah where my ancestors are buried so that I can rebuild it." The request was enormous. Nehemiah wasn't asking for a day off. He wasn't asking for money. He was asking to leave the royal court, travel hundreds of miles, enter a city surrounded by enemies, and rebuild its destroyed walls. The king looked at Nehemiah. Then he asked another question. "How long will your journey take? And when will you return?" Nehemiah gave him a time, but he knew that permission alone would not be enough. He would need protection. He would need resources. So Nehemiah continued. He asked for letters to the governors of the regions he would travel through, granting him safe passage. Then he asked for a letter to Asaph, keeper of the royal forest, so that he could obtain timber for the gates of the city wall, and the house where he would live. It was a bold request, but the king granted it, and Nehemiah understood why. The good hand of my God was upon me. The impossible door had opened. The king had given him permission. The king had given him letters. The king had given him access to the resources he needed. And Nehemiah began the journey toward Jerusalem. But as he traveled, news of his arrival began to spread, and not everyone was happy. Two powerful men heard about Nehemiah's mission: Sanballat, the governor of Samaria, and Tobiah, an influential Ammonite official. They were deeply disturbed that someone had come to seek the welfare of the people of Jerusalem. The journey had barely begun, and opposition was already waiting for him. But Nehemiah kept moving, across the long roads of the Persian Empire, toward the city he had prayed for, toward the ruins he had wept over, toward the walls that everyone else had accepted as broken. Nehemiah was coming home, and he was coming to rebuild. After a long journey, Nehemiah finally arrived in Jerusalem. The city he had spent days praying about was finally in front of him, but seeing it with his own eyes was different. The streets were quiet. The walls were broken. The great gates that had once protected the city had been burned to ashes. Stones were scattered everywhere. The people were vulnerable, and the city that once represented strength now looked defeated. Nehemiah had come with a mission, but before he could rebuild anything, he needed to understand exactly what he was facing. For 3 days, Nehemiah said nothing about his plans. He did not announce his arrival. He did not gather the leaders. He did not tell everyone why he had come. He waited. Then, under the cover of darkness, Nehemiah chose a few trusted men to accompany him. He mounted an animal and quietly left the city. The night was dark. The streets were silent. Only the sound of hooves against the ground broke the silence. Nehemiah rode toward the valley gate, then toward the jackal well, then toward the dung gate. Everywhere he looked, there was destruction. He reached the fountain gate and the king's pool, but the rubble was so great that there was no room for his animal to pass. So Nehemiah got down. He walked through the ruins on foot. He examined the broken walls. He studied the burned gates. He looked at the destruction that had become normal to the people living there. And for the first time, he understood the size of the task before him. This wasn't simply a damaged wall. It was a broken city, a broken people, a broken sense of security. But Nehemiah did not turn around. He returned to the city, and the next morning he called together the Jewish leaders, priests, nobles, officials, and workers. Everyone gathered around him. Nehemiah looked at them. Then he spoke. "You see the trouble we are in. Jerusalem lies in ruins, and its gates have been burned with fire. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem." The people listened. Then Nehemiah told them how God had been with him. He told them about the king. He told them about the permission he had received. He told them about the letters and resources. And finally, he told them something even more important. The gracious hand of my God was upon me. The people looked at one another. For generations, they had lived among those ruins. They had seen the broken walls so many times that perhaps they had stopped believing they could ever be repaired. But now, someone was asking them to believe again. Their response was immediate. Let us start rebuilding. And they began the work. Priests repaired one section. Families repaired another. Goldsmiths worked beside merchants. Rulers worked beside ordinary people. Everyone had a section of the wall. The work was no longer Nehemiah's alone. It belonged to the entire community. Stone by stone, gate by gate, section by section, Jerusalem began to rise again. But there was one thing Nehemiah had not forgotten. He had enemies. Sanballat heard that the Jews were rebuilding the wall, and he was furious. He mocked them publicly. What are these Jews doing? Are they trying to rebuild the wall? Will they really finish it? Tobiah joined him. He looked at the wall and laughed. Even a fox climbing on it would break it down. Their words were meant to humiliate the builders, to make them doubt themselves, to make them stop. But Nehemiah did not answer their insults with fear. He prayed, and the people kept working. The stones continued to move. The gates continued to rise. The wall continued to take shape. For the first time in generations, Jerusalem was beginning to look like a city again. But the enemies were watching, and their mockery would soon become something much more dangerous. Because when they realized that the wall was actually being rebuilt, they would stop laughing, and they would begin to threaten war. Nehemiah had rebuilt the people's hope. Now he would have to defend it. The decision had been made. Jerusalem would be rebuilt, and the people went to work. Morning after morning, the sound of hammers and chisels filled the city. Stones were lifted. Timbers were carried. Broken gates were cleared away. The walls that had once been nothing but piles of rubble slowly began to rise again. Nehemiah organized the work carefully. He did not ask everyone to rebuild the same section. Instead, families, priests, craftsmen, merchants, and leaders each took responsibility for a portion of the wall. Everyone had a place. Everyone had a purpose. And everyone understood that they were rebuilding more than stones. They were rebuilding the identity of their people. At one section of the wall, priests worked with their hands. At another, families worked together. Elsewhere, skilled craftsmen repaired gates and strengthened the foundations. People who had once looked at the ruins with hopelessness were now looking at them with determination. Every stone placed on the wall felt like another step toward restoration. But as the wall grew, so did the anger of Jerusalem's enemies. Sanballat heard that the rebuilding was progressing. He was furious, and soon Nehemiah would receive an invitation that looked harmless, but it was a trap. The walls of Jerusalem were rising, but the closer the people came to finishing the work, the more desperate their enemies became. Sanballat, Tobiah, and the surrounding enemies had already tried mockery. It had failed. They had threatened violence. The people responded by taking up weapons. So now, they turned to deception. Sanballat and Geshem sent a message to Nehemiah. Come, let us meet together in one of the villages on the plain of Ono. It sounded reasonable. Perhaps they wanted peace. Perhaps they wanted to negotiate. Perhaps they wanted to end the conflict. But Nehemiah knew better. He understood that the invitation was a trap. His answer was simple. I am carrying on a great project and cannot go down. Why should the work stop while I leave it and come down to you? They sent the message again, and again, 4 times. Each time, Nehemiah gave the same answer. He would not leave the wall. He would not abandon the work. He would not allow distraction to become destruction. But the enemies were not finished. On the 5th attempt, Sanballat sent an open letter accusing Nehemiah of planning a rebellion against King. The accusation was serious. If it reached King Artaxerxes, Nehemiah could lose everything. His position, his freedom, even his life. Sanballat claimed that Nehemiah wanted to make himself king. He claimed that Nehemiah was preparing a rebellion, and he threatened to report these accusations to the king. But Nehemiah saw through the lie. He knew they were simply trying to frighten the workers. So he answered, Nothing like what you are saying is happening. You are just making it up out of your head. Nehemiah refused to allow fear to control him. Then came another attempt. A man named Shemaiah approached Nehemiah secretly. He warned him that people were coming to kill him. He urged Nehemiah to hide inside the temple. Let us meet inside the temple. Let us shut the doors. They are coming to kill you. It sounded like protection, but Nehemiah immediately recognized another trap. He knew that entering the temple in that way would violate God's law. His enemies wanted him to act out of fear. They wanted him to run. They wanted him to compromise. They wanted the people to see their leader hiding. But Nehemiah refused. Should a man like me run away? Should someone like me go into the temple to save his life? No, he would not run. He would not compromise. He would not surrender his integrity just to protect himself. Instead, Nehemiah prayed, "Now strengthen my hands." The attacks continued, but so did the work. The people kept building. The wall kept rising. And something incredible began to happen. The gaps in the wall were disappearing. The broken sections were being connected. The gates were being restored. The city was becoming whole again. But while the physical wall was being rebuilt, Nehemiah also faced another battle. Not every problem was coming from outside Jerusalem. Inside the city, some of the poorest people were beginning to cry out. They were hungry. They were losing their land. They were struggling to pay their taxes. Some had even been forced to sell their children into slavery to survive. And while the enemies were trying to destroy Jerusalem from outside, greed and injustice were threatening the people from within. Nehemiah was furious. He could not allow the walls to be rebuilt while the people behind those walls were being oppressed. So he confronted the nobles and officials. "Are you charging interest from your own people? Shouldn't you walk in the fear of our God?" He demanded that the people be given back their fields, vineyards, houses, and money. The nobles agreed. Nehemiah had shown them something important. Leadership was not simply about building walls. It was about protecting people. It was about justice. It was about doing what was right even when it was difficult. And still, the work continued. The enemies kept watching. The threats continued. The pressure grew. But Nehemiah refused to stop. The people were exhausted. Their hands were tired. Their bodies were weary. But every morning they returned to the wall, because they could see something now. The impossible was becoming possible. The wall was almost complete. And the enemies knew it. They had failed to stop the work with mockery. They had failed with threats. They had failed with deception. And now, they had only one thing left to fear: completion. Nehemiah looked across the city. The wall that had once been nothing but ruins now surrounded Jerusalem. Only a few gaps remained. The finish line was in sight. And after everything they had endured, the people were about to witness a miracle. The wall would be completed. But what happened next would be remembered for generations. The walls of Jerusalem were almost complete. Situation was desperate. Then one morning, the final stones were placed. The last gaps were closed. The gates were secured. The work that had once seemed impossible was complete. The wall of Jerusalem had been rebuilt in just 52 days. 52 days. What had stood in ruins for generations had been restored in less than 2 months. The enemies heard about it, and they became afraid, because they realized something. This was not simply the work of human hands. They knew that this work had been accomplished with the help of God. Nehemiah stood on the completed wall and looked across Jerusalem. The city was no longer defenseless. The people were no longer hopeless. The ruins had become walls. The broken gates had become entrances. The people had rediscovered courage. But Nehemiah knew something else. Rebuilding the walls was only part of the mission. So Nehemiah gathered the people, and something remarkable happened. The people came together as one. Men, women, children, families, leaders, workers. Everyone gathered in the square before the water gate, and they asked Ezra the priest and teacher to bring out the book of the law of Moses. Ezra stood before the people. He opened the scroll, and the entire assembly became silent. The word of God was read aloud. For hours, the people listened. The priests and Levites explained what the scriptures meant so that everyone could understand. And as the people listened, they began to realize how far they had wandered from God. The rebuilding of the walls had revealed something deeper. Their city had been broken, but their relationship with God had also been broken. People began to weep. Tears filled the square. They mourned their disobedience. They remembered their history. They remembered the faithfulness of God, and they realized that despite everything, God had never abandoned them. But Nehemiah did not allow the people to remain trapped in their sorrow. He stood before them and said, "Do not mourn or weep. Go and enjoy choice food and sweet drinks. Send some to those who have nothing prepared. This day is holy to our Lord. Do not grieve, for the joy of the Lord is your strength. The people listened, and something changed. Their tears became worship. Their mourning became celebration. Their fear became hope. The city began to come alive. Families gathered together. Food was shared with those who had nothing. People praised God. The rebuilt walls became a symbol of something greater. God had brought his people back, not only to a city, but back to himself.